First, I would like to thank Drs. Susan Maros and Vince Bantu for organizing the 2022 Missiology lectures and facilitating a global conversation between scholars and practitioners from a variety of social and cultural locations to explore ways in which women enact their personal and collective power and agency in the mission of God. It is a timely topic given the vast majority of world religions continue to find men holding the highest position of power and authority throughout the world. I am honored to be invited to respond to Dr. Elizabeth Hall's lecture on challenging sexism for God's sake. She provides an excellent overview of research and debate on women in the field of psychology and how power imbalance is played out between the sexes in general, but particularly widespread in Christian contexts, laying out the unique barriers, challenges, and forms of oppression women still face today. More specifically, based on social psychologists Glick and Frith's work on ambivalent sexism, she describes hostile sexism or adversarial view toward women seeking power and control is complementarily conjoined by benevolent sexism. Though seemingly positive and often happens with good intentions, it is argued benevolence and subordination are juxtaposed at the structural institutional level and contribute to perpetuating women's inferior position and unfair treatment outside of conscious awareness. In the interest of time, I will briefly share my reflections on the following three main areas: hostile sexism in current global context, intersectionality of structural benevolent discrimination, and macro-cultural and liberation psychology perspective. First, Dr. Hall expounds largely on benevolent sexism, which she explains plays an important role in religious contexts, while being more insidious, it is often seen as harmless. Based on studies cited, she suggested benevolent sexism may be more detrimental than hostile sexism. However, this may not be the case for diverse minority groups in the US or global communities around the world. The recent developments in South Korea, for example, show that hostile sexism, negative views toward individuals who violate traditional gender roles, and aggressive misogyny are pressing concerns, with a staggering 78.9% of men in their 20s think gender discrimination against men is the most serious sources of problem. The report depicts a growing discontent among young men who oppose feminism and feel threatened and left behind in a deeply patriarchal country where women still face significant discrimination and highest gender wage gap among industrialized nations. South Korea ranks 115th out of 149 countries on gender equality. Despite growing public awareness and policy efforts, gender equality clearly has not yet been fully established in Western societies, but hostile, misogynistic attitudes may be more intensified in non-Western societies due to rapid changes. Previous research has shown that hostile and benevolent sexual attitudes, which are grounded in traditional gender stereotypes, play a key role in the reproduction of gender inequalities. With a growing trend of anti-feminist attitudes and hostile sexism in younger generation of men, such as in South Korea, future studies should explore prevalence of both hostile and benevolent sexism, particularly in adolescent and emerging adults, and seek more integrative explanation of cultural and moral religious dimensions of aggressive sexism and underlying motivation processes in the context in which individuals are embedded. Secondly, while I appreciated Dr. Hall's attention to structural sexism, I would like to take this a step further and add that structural and subtle forms of discrimination rarely isolate gender as the only variable, but in everyday life, inequality often intersect multiple categories, such as ethnicity and class. Although intersectionality is briefly mentioned as a separate point in Dr. Hall's presentation, I believe it requires central focus, especially in the current climate. Western feminism has been critiqued because of its tendency to center and privilege the experience of white middle-class women. Like benevolent sexism, benevolent racism is a much-needed area of study which involves a subtle form of racism that openly condemns the racial and social inequalities at formal structural level, but informally further reinforces racist attitudes, policies, and practices that maintain superiority of the benevolent actors. Migrants, for instance, are often stereotypically depicted in studies as other, victims of poverty, lacking education, needing language skills, which contribute to perpetuating their position of inferiority and legitimize need for benevolence and subordination. Historically, this is not unlike in colonial literature. The subtle forms of othering is used to construct the natives as exotic and vulnerable and justify imposing what is thought to be desirable and ideal standards based on values of those who hold power. Thus, benevolent discrimination is fundamentally built on othering process and conceiving differences as part of natural hierarchy. For example, constructing professional competence around valuing white maleness during the recruitment, employment, or promotion process is one way hegemony of one group is legitimized and perpetuated. In this way, it is critical to recognize that benevolent discrimination is inherently intersectional. In ordinary situations, inequality is tacitly practiced and intersects multiple categories such as ethnicity, class, and gender. Although formalized diversity initiatives openly condemn discriminatory practices in many institutions, they prevent perpetrators from seeing subtle effects of discrimination at the structural level and how they contribute to reproducing discrimination. In the final section, Dr. Hall ties in lessons from the research on sexism and discusses her intervening steps. I firmly agree with Dr. Hall that sexism is a serious and pervasive problem, and that it is both target and barrier to God's mission. However, I find her recommendation for the way forward could be more specific and contextual. To her concrete comment that Christianity seems to have made things worse rather than better, I would add that modern psychology, largely based on North America and Europe, has contributed to further confusion in the global context. According to cultural psychologist Karl Ratner, psychology does not just overlook but actively obscures culture by psychologizing and reducing it to micro level factors and processes originating from intra-individual mechanisms. In this way, oppression is simply reduced to stressors or personal triggers and vulnerabilities. Because historically psychology has undervalued the impact of culture on human behavior and function, psychology as a whole basically served to legitimize the status quo rather than produce genuine change or transformation. Even at the organizational level, diversity initiatives or reforms have promoted general depoliticized measures that have perpetuated rather than fully addressed discrimination at the structural level. Genuine transformation requires concrete structural reorganization of the status quo in order to generate comprehensive, deep social psychological change. Emancipatory liberation psychologists, such as Ignacio Martin-Barros' work in El Salvador, demonstrate the social and psychological improvement in dealing with oppressions and intersecting regimes of multiple inequality, such as class, ethnicity, and gender, require confronting and transforming the macro cultural political power structures. Individuals nested within oppressive systems require interventions at all levels to reach empowerment. Merely focusing at the intra-individual psychological level while ignoring the macro-cultural structural issues only perpetuates oppression and further isolates the individual by ignoring the wider system at play. We need to understand gender-based oppression from a multi-systemic, global perspective and challenge complex web of injustice from multiple levels, including the individual, institutional, and structural. Thank you.